Hi, this is Mike Wheeler at the Marks Center Alexandria campus of the Institute for Defense Analyses. We're continuing our discussion with General Larry Welch on issues that have raised during the nuclear age. General, over the course of several hours now, we've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about Strategic Air Command and Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff and how it evolved into Strategic Command. We've talked about arms control from the earliest days to where we are today. We've talked about the nuclear triad. We've talked about how you develop forces. We've talked about nuclear testing. We've talked about the enterprise, which includes the production and the design laboratories. We've talked about space, cyberspace, precision strike, and the role that they play. We've talked about nuclear abolition. We've talked a great deal about proliferation. We've talked about missile defense. We've talked about nuclear terrorism. We've talked about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the development of strategic bombing doctrine. We've talked about Russia and China earlier and today. We've talked about the development of deterrence strategy. We've talked about the alliances in the Atlantic, NATO in particular, and in the Pacific. We've talked about extended deterrence. We've talked about the importance of assurance to allies. We've talked about theater nuclear forces. We've talked about your long career since you were born in 1934, both in the Air Force and at the Institute for Defense Analyses. There's not much that we haven't covered over the course of the last several hours.
Well, I think if you look at that whole panoply of subjects that we've talked about, maybe there's a couple of things that come out of that that are useful. One is that understanding and studying history is always terribly useful as long as you understand that history does not really repeat itself, that there is always continuing evolution, and that the future is never quite what you expected, and it's certainly not like the past. But I think the other thing that comes out of it is the evolution is just simply accelerating. And it's not just technology that's accelerating. It's the speed at which things happen in the world. That during the Cold War, for example, if a place like IDA went off and studied a subject for a year, you could come back and probably still be relevant if you just studied it for a year, because things changed year to year only incrementally. Today, if you study something for 6 months or 3 months and don't stay current on what's happening in the world, but by the time you get through, it's likely that what you studied is irrelevant. Because today the world can change overnight. You know, the attack on the World Trade Center changed the world overnight in a very fundamental way. So I just listened to the graduation speech by General Dunford speaking to the National Defense University graduation. My daughter-in-law just graduated from the Eisenhower School, but so it was the assembled graduates of the 4 schools at Fort McNair. His speech was about being open to change and about the pace of change, which I thought was particularly relevant. So if you stack up all those subjects that we talked about and say, which of those are relevant today? Which of them do I really need to understand? My answer always has to be, how are they related to what I'm dealing with today? Certainly understand Stalin is relevant to understanding Putin. And understanding the Cold War is relevant to having any possibility of understanding what's happening in the Middle East. You know, they don't seem to have much connection, but oh, they do. If you consider that the situation in the Middle East is an outgrowth of World War I, and then World War II, and then the Cold War conflict between the United States and Great Britain and what is now Russia, and all the things that happened in that region that were ancillary to the conflict. In other words, it didn't happen in the region because of what was going on in the region. They happened in the region because they affected head on the other bigger issues. So again, taking the time to understand the flow of, I'll call it history, but it's the flow of continually developing history, is the only way I know that you really can get a fairly solid handle on what's motivating all kinds of activity today. What's motivating decisions by people we're worried about. Our decisions, the way we tend to respond to that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, I can look back to I haven't done arithmetic lately, 60 plus years that I've been in the national security environment. And because of that, I can really understand what a terrible mistake it would be to assume that history repeats itself. And it would be an equally terrible mistake to not understand what's happened in history. So I think that I would leave it there, because if you talk about the Cold War and the current situation between our allies and our potential Eurasian adversary, Russia, and between all of our allies and areas of interest in the South Pacific and China, who has in the past been a friend, then understanding those dynamics gives you the opportunity to actually shape things in a positive way. Take advantage of history, but shape the kind of future that comes out of understanding. And it comes out of always keeping your eye on what's our national interest and how do we interface that with and reinforce others' national interests. And that's about the best advice I can give you about that.
Well, that's great advice. Thank you so much,
Sure
General Welch. Really appreciate you having done this.
Okay.